Chapters 8 and 9 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This recording is in the public domain. As she was devoted to romantic effects, Lord Warburton ventured to express a hope that she would come some day and see his house, a very curious old place. He extracted from Mrs. Touchett a promise that she would bring her niece to Lochley, and Ralph signified his willingness to attend the ladies if his father should be able to spare him. Lord Warburton assured our heroine that in the meantime his sisters would come and see her. She knew something about his sisters, having sounded him, during the hours they spent together while he was at Gardencourt, on many points connected with his family. When Isabel was interested she asked a great many questions, and as her companion was a copious talker, she urged him on this occasion by no means in vain. He told her he had 4 sisters and 2 brothers, and had lost both his parents. The brothers and sisters were very good people, not particularly clever, you know, he said, but very decent and pleasant, and he was so good as to hope Miss Archer might know them well. One of the brothers was in the church, settled in the family living, that of Lochley, which was a heavy, sprawling parish, and was an excellent fellow in spite of his thinking differently from himself on every conceivable topic. And then Lord Warburton mentioned some of the opinions held by his brother, which were opinions Isabel had often heard expressed, and that she supposed to be entertained by a considerable portion of the human family. Many of them, indeed, she supposed she had held herself, till he assured her she was quite mistaken, that it was really impossible, that she had doubtless imagined she entertained them, but that she might depend that, if she thought about them over a little, she would find there was nothing in them. When she answered that she had already thought several of the questions involved over very attentively, he declared that she was only another example of what he had often been struck with, the fact that of all the people in the world the Americans were the most grossly superstitious. They were rank Tories and bigots, every one of them. There were no conservatives like American conservatives. Her uncle and her cousin were there to prove it. Nothing could be more mediaeval than many of their views. They had ideas that people in England nowadays were ashamed to confess to. And they had the impudence, moreover, said his lordship, laughing, to pretend they knew more about the needs and dangers of this poor dear stupid old England than he who was born in it and owned a considerable slice of it. The more shame to him. From all of which Isabel gathered that Lord Warburton was a nobleman of the newest pattern, a reformer, a radical, a contemner of ancient ways. His other brother, who was in the army in India, was rather wild and pig-headed, and had not been of much use as yet but to make debts for Warburton to pay, one of the most precious privileges of an elder brother. "I don't think I shall pay any more," said her friend. "He lives a monstrous deal better than I do, enjoys unheard of luxuries, and thinks himself a much finer gentleman than I. As I'm a consistent radical, I go in only for equality. I don't go in for the superiority of the younger brothers." 2 of his 4 sisters, the second and the fourth, were married, one of them having done very well, as they said, the other only so-so. The husband of the elder, Lord Haycock, was a very good fellow, but unfortunately a horrid Tory, and his wife, like all good English wives, was worse than her husband. The other had espoused a smallish squire in Norfolk, and though married but the other day, had already 5 children. This information and much more Lord Warburton imparted to his young American listener, taking pains to make many things clear, and to lay bare to her apprehension the peculiarities of English life. Isabel was often amused at his explicitness, and at the small allowance he seemed to make either for her own experience or for her imagination. "He thinks I'm a barbarian," she said, "and that I've never seen forks and spoons." And she used to ask him artless questions for the pleasure of hearing him answer seriously. Then, when he had fallen into the trap, "It's a pity you can't see me in my war paint and feathers," she remarked. "If I had known how kind you are to the poor savages, I would have brought over my native costume." Lord Warburton had travelled through the United States and knew much more about them than Isabel. He was so good as to say that America was the most charming country in the world, but his recollections of it appeared to encourage the idea that Americans in England would need to have a great many things explained to them. "If I had only had you to explain things to me in America!" he said. "I was rather puzzled in your country. In fact, I was quite bewildered. And the trouble was that the explanations only puzzled me more. You know, I think they often gave me the wrong ones on purpose. They're rather clever about that over there. But when I explain you can trust me. About what I tell you there's no mistake." There was no mistake, at least, about his being very intelligent and cultivated and knowing almost everything in the world. Although he gave the most interesting and thrilling glimpses, Isabel felt he never did it to exhibit himself, and though he had had rare chances and had tumbled in, as she put it, for high prizes, he was as far as possible from making a merit of it. He had enjoyed the best things of life, but they had not spoiled his sense of proportion. His quality was a mixture of the effect of rich experience, oh, so easily come by, with a modesty at times almost boyish, the sweet and wholesome savour of which, it was as agreeable as something tasted, lost nothing from the addition of a tone of responsible kindness. "I like your specimen English gentleman very much," Isabel said to Ralph after Lord Warburton had gone. "I like him too, I love him well," Ralph returned, "but I pity him more." Isabel looked at him askance. "Why, that seems to me his only fault. One can't pity him a little. He appears to have everything, to know everything, to be everything." "Oh, he's in a bad way," Ralph insisted. "I suppose you don't mean in health?" "No, as to that he's detestably sound. What I mean is that he's a man with a great position who's playing all sorts of tricks with it. He doesn't take himself seriously." "Does he regard himself as a joke?" "Much worse. He regards himself as an imposition, as an abuse." "Well, perhaps he is," said Isabel. "Perhaps he is, though on the whole I don't think so. But in that case, what's more pitiable than a sentient, self-conscious abuse planted by other hands, deeply rooted but aching with a sense of its injustice? For me, in his place, I could be as solemn as a statue of Buddha. He occupies a position that appeals to my imagination. Great responsibilities, great opportunities, great consideration, great wealth, great power, a natural share in the public affairs of a great country. But he's all in a muddle about himself, his position, his power, and indeed about everything in the world. He's the victim of a critical age. He has ceased to believe in himself, and he doesn't know what to believe in. When I attempt to tell him, because if I were he, I know very well what I should believe in, he calls me a pampered bigot. I believe he seriously thinks me an awful Philistine. He says I don't understand my time. I understand it certainly better than he, who could neither abolish himself as a nuisance nor maintain himself as an institution." "He doesn't look very wretched," Isabel observed. "Possibly not, though, being a man of a good deal of charming taste, I think he often has uncomfortable hours. But what is it to say of a being of his opportunities that he's not miserable? Besides, I believe he is." "I don't," said Isabel. "Well," her cousin rejoined, "if he isn't he ought to be." In the afternoon she spent an hour with her uncle on the lawn, where the old man sat, as usual, with his shawl over his legs and his large cup of diluted tea in his hands. In the course of conversation he asked her what she thought of their late visitor. Isabel was prompt. "I think he's charming." "He's a nice person," said Mr. Touchett, "but I don't recommend you to fall in love with him." "I shall not do it then. I shall never fall in love but on your recommendation. Moreover," Isabel added, "my cousin gives me a rather sad account of Lord Warburton." "Oh, indeed? I don't know what there may be to say, but you must remember that Ralph must talk." He thinks your friend's too subversive, or not subversive enough. I don't quite understand which," said Isabel. The old man shook his head slowly, smiled, and put down his cup. "I don't know which either. He goes very far, but it's quite possible he doesn't go far enough. He seems to want to do away with a good many things, but he seems to want to remain himself. I suppose that's natural, but it's rather inconsistent." "Oh, I hope he'll remain himself," said Isabel. "If he were to be done away, his friends would miss him sadly." "Well," said the old man, "I guess he'll stay and amuse his friends. I should certainly miss him very much here at Gardencourt. He always amuses me when he comes over, and I think he amuses himself as well. There's a considerable number like him round in society. They're very fashionable just now. I don't know what they're trying to do, whether they're trying to get up a revolution. I hope at any rate they'll put it off till after I'm gone. You see, they want to disestablish everything, but I'm a pretty big landowner here, and I don't want to be disestablished." "I wouldn't have come over if I had thought that they were going to behave like that," Mr. Tutchett went on with expanding hilarity. "I came over because I thought England was a safe country. I call it a regular fraud if they're going to introduce any considerable changes. There'll be a large number disappointed in that case." "Oh, I do hope they'll make a revolution!" Isabel exclaimed. "I should delight in seeing a revolution." "Let me see," said her uncle, with a humorous intention. "I forget whether you're on the side of the old or on the side of the new. I've heard you take such opposite views." "I'm on the side of both. I guess I'm a little on the side of everything. In a revolution, after it was well begun, I think I should be a high, proud loyalist. One sympathises more with them, and they've a chance to behave so exquisitely. I mean so picturesquely." "I don't know that I understand what you mean by behaving picturesquely, but it seems to me that you do that always, my dear." "Oh, you lovely man, if I could believe that!" the girl interrupted. "I'm afraid, after all, you won't have the pleasure of going gracefully to the guillotine here just now," Mr. Tutchett went on. "If you want to see a big outbreak you must pay us a long visit. You see, when you come to the point it wouldn't suit them to be taken at their word." "Of whom are you speaking?" "Well, I mean Lord Warburton and his friends, the Radicals of the upper class. Of course I only know the way it strikes me. They talk about the changes, but I don't think they quite realise. You and I, you know, we know what it is to have lived under democratic institutions. I always thought them very comfortable, but I was used to them from the first. And then I ain't a lord. You're a lady, my dear, but I ain't a lord. Now, over here, I don't think it quite comes home to them. It's a matter of every day and every hour, and I don't think many of them would find it as pleasant as what they've got. Of course, if they want to try, it's their own business, but I expect they won't try very hard." "Don't you think they're sincere?" Isabel asked. "Well, they want to feel earnest," Mr. Tutchett allowed, "but it seems as if they took it out in theories mostly. Their radical views are a kind of amusement. They've got to have some amusement, and they might have coarser tastes than that. You see, they're very luxurious, and these progressive ideas are about their biggest luxury. They make them feel moral, and yet don't damage their position. They think a great deal of their position. Don't let one of them ever persuade you he doesn't, for if you were to proceed on that basis you'd be pulled up very short." Isabel followed her uncle's argument, which he unfolded with his quaint distinctness, most attentively, and though she was unacquainted with the British aristocracy, she found it in harmony with her general impressions of human nature. But she felt moved to put in a protest on Lord Warburton's behalf. "I don't believe Lord Warburton's a humbug. I don't care what the others are. I should like to see Lord Warburton put to the test." "Heaven deliver me from my friends!" Mr. Tutchett answered. "Lord Warburton's a very amiable young man, a very fine young man. He has 100,000 a year. He owns 50,000 acres of the soil of this little island, and ever so many other things besides. He has half a dozen houses to live in. He has a seat in Parliament, as I have one at my own dinner table. He has elegant tastes, cares for literature, for art, for science, for charming young ladies. The most elegant is his taste for the new views. It affords him a great deal of pleasure, more perhaps than anything else, except the young ladies. His old house over there, what does he call it, Lochley, is very attractive, but I don't think it's as pleasant as this. That doesn't matter, however, he has so many others. His views don't hurt any one as far as I can see, they certainly don't hurt himself. And if there were to be a revolution, he would come off very easily. They wouldn't touch him, they'd leave him as he is. He's too much liked." "Ah, he couldn't be a martyr even if he wished," Isabel sighed. "That's a very poor position." "He'll never be a martyr unless you make him one," said the old man. Isabel shook her head. There might have been something laughable in the fact that she did it with a touch of melancholy. "I shall never make any one a martyr." "You'll never be one, I hope." "I hope not." "But you don't pity Lord Warburton, then, as Ralph does?" Her uncle looked at her a while with genial acuteness. "Yes, I do, after all." Chapter 9. The two Mrs. Molyneux, this nobleman's sisters, came presently to call upon her, and Isabel took a fancy to the young ladies, who appeared to her to show a most original stamp. It is true that when she described them to her cousin by that term, he declared that no epithet could be less applicable than this to the two Misses Molyneux, since there were 50,000 young women in England who exactly resembled them. Deprived of this advantage, however, Isabel's visitors retained that of an extreme sweetness and shyness of demeanour, and of having, as she thought, eyes like the balanced basins, the circles of ornamental water, set in parterres among the geraniums. "They're not morbid, at any rate, whatever they are," our heroine said to herself, and she deemed this a great charm, for two or three of the friends of her girlhood had been regrettably open to the charge, they would have been so nice without it, to say nothing of Isabel's having occasionally suspected it as a tendency of her own. The Misses Molyneux were not in their first youth, but they had bright, fresh complexions, and something of the smile of childhood. Yes, their eyes, which Isabel admired, were round, quiet, and contented, and their figures, also of a generous roundness, were encased in sealskin jackets. Their friendliness was great, so great that they were almost embarrassed to show it. They seemed somewhat afraid of the young lady from the other side of the world, and rather looked than spoke their good wishes. But they made it clear to her that they hoped she would come to luncheon at Lochley, where they lived with their brother, and then they might see her very, very often. They wondered if she wouldn't come over some day and sleep. They were expecting some people on the 29th, so perhaps she would come while the people were there. "I'm afraid it isn't any one very remarkable," said the elder sister, "but I dare say you'll take us as you find us." "I shall find you delightful. I think you're enchanting just as you are," replied Isabel, who often praised profusely. Her visitors flushed, and her cousin told her, after they were gone, that if she said such things to those poor girls they would think she was in some wild, free manner practising on them. He was sure it was the first time they had been called enchanting. "I can't help it," Isabel answered. "I think it's lovely to be so quiet and reasonable and satisfied. I should like to be like that." "Heaven forbid!" cried Ralph with ardour. "I mean to try and imitate them," said Isabel. "I want very much to see them at home." She had this pleasure a few days later, when, with Ralph and his mother, she drove over to Lochley. She found the Misses Molyneux sitting in a vast drawing room (she perceived afterwards it was one of several) in a wilderness of faded chintz. They were dressed on this occasion in black velveteen. Isabel liked them even better at home than she had done at Gardencourt, and was more than ever struck with the fact that they were not morbid. It had seemed to her before that if they had a fault it was a want of play of mind, but she presently saw they were capable of deep emotion. Before luncheon she was alone with him for some time on one side of the room, while Lord Warburton, at a distance, talked to Mrs. Touchett. "Is it true your brother's such a great radical?" Isabel asked. She knew it was true, but we have seen that her interest in human nature was keen, and she had a desire to draw the Misses Molyneux out. "Oh dear, yes, he's immensely advanced," said Mildred, the younger sister. "At the same time Warburton's very reasonable," Miss Molyneux observed. Isabel watched him a moment at the other side of the room. He was clearly trying hard to make himself agreeable to Mrs. Touchett. Ralph had met the frank advances of one of the dogs before the fire that the temperature of an English August in the ancient expanses had not made an impertinence. "Do you suppose your brother's sincere?" Isabel inquired with a smile. "Oh, he must be, you know!" Mildred exclaimed quickly, while the elder sister gazed at our heroine in silence. "Do you think he would stand the test?" "The test?" "I mean, for instance, having to give up all this." "Having to give up Lockleigh?" said Miss Molyneux, finding her voice. "Yes, and the other places. What are they called?" The two sisters exchanged an almost frightened glance. "Do you mean on account of the expense?" the younger one asked. "I daresay he might let one or two of his houses," said the other. "Let them for nothing?" Isabel demanded. "I can't fancy his giving up his property," said Miss Molyneux. "Ah, I'm afraid he is an impostor," Isabel returned. "Don't you think it's a false position?" Her companions evidently had lost themselves. "My brother's position?" Miss Molyneux inquired. "It's thought a very good position," said the younger sister. "It's the first position in this part of the country." "I daresay you think me very irreverent," Isabel took occasion to remark. "I suppose you revere your brother and are rather afraid of him." "Of course one looks up to one's brother," said Miss Molyneux simply. "If you do that he must be very good, because you, evidently, are beautifully good." "He's most kind. It will never be known the good he does." "His ability is known," Mildred added. "Every one thinks it's immense." "Oh, I can see that," said Isabel. "But if I were he I should wish to fight to the death. I mean for the heritage of the past. I should hold it tight." "I think one ought to be liberal," Mildred argued gently. "We've always been so, even from the earliest times." "Ah, well," said Isabel, "you've made a great success of it. I don't wonder you like it. I see you're very fond of crewels." When Lord Warburton showed her the house after luncheon, it seemed to her a matter of course that it should be a noble picture. Within, it had been a good deal modernised. Some of the best points had lost their purity, but as they saw it from the gardens, a stout grey pile, of the softest, deepest, most weather fretted hue, rising from a broad still moat, it affected the young visitor as a castle in a legend. The day was cool and rather lustreless. The first note of autumn had been struck, and the watery sunshine rested on the walls in blurred and desultory gleams, washing them, as it were, in places tenderly chosen, where the ache of antiquity was the keenest. Her host's brother, the vicar, had come to luncheon, and Isabel had had 5 minutes' talk with him, time enough to institute a search for a rich ecclesiasticism and give it up as vain. The marks of the Vicar of Lockleigh were a big athletic figure, a candid natural countenance, a capacious appetite, and a tendency to indiscriminate laughter. Isabel learned afterwards from her cousin that before taking orders he had been a mighty wrestler, and that he was still, on occasion, in the privacy of the family circle, as it were, quite capable of flooring his man. Isabel liked him. She was in the mood for liking everything, but her imagination was a good deal taxed to think of him as a source of spiritual aid. The whole party, on leaving lunch, went to walk in the grounds, but Lord Warburton exercised some ingenuity in engaging his least familiar guest in a stroll apart from the others. "I wish you to see the place properly, seriously," he said. "You can't do it if your attention is distracted by irrelevant gossip." His own conversation, though he told Isabel a good deal about the house, which had a very curious history, was not purely archaeological. He reverted at intervals to matters more personal, matters personal to the young lady as well as to himself. But at last, after a pause of some duration, returning for a moment to their ostensible theme, "Ah, well," he said, "I'm very glad indeed you like the old barrack. I wish you could see more of it, that you could stay here a while. My sisters have taken an immense fancy to you, if that would be any inducement." "There's no want of inducements," Isabel answered, "but I'm afraid I can't make engagements. I'm quite in my aunt's hands." "Ah, pardon me if I say I don't exactly believe that. I'm pretty sure you can do whatever you want." "I'm sorry if I make that impression on you. I don't think it's a nice impression to make." "It has the merit of permitting me to hope," and Lord Warburton paused a moment. "To hope what?" "That in future I may see you often?" "Ah," said Isabel, "to enjoy that pleasure I needn't be so terribly emancipated." "Doubtless not, and yet at the same time I don't think your uncle likes me." "You're very much mistaken. I've heard him speak very highly of you." "I'm glad you have talked about me," said Lord Warburton, "but I nevertheless don't think he'd like me to keep coming to Gardencourt." "I can't answer for my uncle's tastes," the girl rejoined, "though I ought as far as possible to take them into account. But for myself I shall be very glad to see you." "Now that's what I like to hear you say. I'm charmed when you say that." "You're easily charmed, my lord," said Isabel. "No, I'm not easily charmed." And then he stopped a moment. "But you've charmed me, Miss Archer." These words were uttered with an indefinable sound which startled the girl. It struck her as the prelude to something grave. She had heard the sound before and she recognised it. She had no wish, however, that for the moment such a prelude should have a sequel, and she said as gaily as possible, and as quickly as an appreciable degree of agitation would allow her, "I'm afraid there's no prospect of my being able to come here again." "Never?" said Lord Warburton. "I won't say never. I should feel very melodramatic." "May I come and see you then some day next week?" "Most assuredly. What is there to prevent it?" "Nothing tangible. But with you I never feel safe. I've a sort of sense that you're always summing people up." "You don't of necessity lose by that." "It's very kind of you to say so. But even if I gain, stern justice is not what I most love. Is Mrs. Touchett going to take you abroad?" "I hope so." "Is England not good enough for you?" "That's a very Machiavellian speech. It doesn't deserve an answer. I want to see as many countries as I can." "Then you'll go on judging, I suppose." "Enjoying, I hope, too." "Yes, that's what you enjoy most. I can't make out what you're up to," said Lord Warburton. "You strike me as having mysterious purposes, vast designs." "You're so good as to have a theory about me which I don't at all fill out. Is there anything mysterious in a purpose entertained and executed every year, in the most public manner, by 50,000 of my fellow countrymen, the purpose of improving one's mind by foreign travel?" "You can't improve your mind, Miss Archer," her companion declared. "It's already a most formidable instrument. It looks down on us all. It despises us." "Despises you? You're making fun of me," said Isabel seriously. "Well, you think us quaint. That's the same thing. I won't be thought quaint to begin with. I'm not so in the least. I protest." "That protest is one of the quaintest things I've ever heard," Isabel answered with a smile. Lord Warburton was briefly silent. "You judge only from the outside. You don't care," he said presently. "You only care to amuse yourself." The note she had heard in his voice a moment before reappeared, and mixed with it now was an audible strain of bitterness, a bitterness so abrupt and inconsequent that the girl was afraid she had hurt him. She had often heard that the English are a highly eccentric people. and she had even read in some ingenious author that they are at bottom the most romantic of races. Was Lord Warburton suddenly turning romantic? Was he going to make her a scene in his own house, only the third time they had met? She was reassured quickly enough by her sense of his great good manners, which was not impaired by the fact that he had already touched the furthest limits of good taste in expressing his admiration of a young lady who had confided in his hospitality. She was right in trusting to his good manners, for he presently went on, laughing a little, and without a trace of the accent that had discomposed her. "I don't mean, of course, that you amuse yourself with trifles. You select great materials, the foibles, the afflictions of human nature, the peculiarities of nations." "As regards that," said Isabel, "I should find in my own nation entertainment for a lifetime. But we've a long drive, and my aunt will soon wish to start." She turned back toward the others, and Lord Warburton walked beside her in silence. But before they reached the others, "I shall come and see you next week," he said. She had received an appreciable shock, but as it died away she felt she couldn't pretend to herself that it was altogether a painful one. Nevertheless she made answer to his declaration coldly enough. "Just as you please." And her coldness was not the calculation of her effect, a game she played in a much smaller degree than would have seemed probable to many critics. It came from a certain fear. Chapter 10. Of the Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The day after her visit to Lochley she received a note from her friend Miss Stackpole, a note of which the envelope, exhibiting in conjunction the postmark of Liverpool and the neat calligraphy of the quick-fingered Henrietta, caused her some liveliness of emotion. "Here I am, my lovely friend," Miss Stackpole wrote. "I managed to get off at last. I decided only the night before I left New York, the interviewer having come round to my figure. I put a few things into a bag like a veteran journalist and came down to the steamer in a street car. Where are you and where can we meet? I suppose you are visiting at some castle or other and have already acquired the correct accent. Perhaps even you have married a lord. I almost hope you have, for I want some introductions to the first people and shall count on you for a few." The interviewer wants some light on the nobility. "My first impressions of the people at large are not rose-coloured, but I wish to talk them over with you, and you know that, whatever I am, at least I'm not superficial. I've also something very particular to tell you. Do appoint a meeting as quickly as you can. Come to London, I should like so much to visit the sights with you, or else let me come to you wherever you are. I will do so with pleasure, for you know everything interests me, and I wish to see as much as possible of the inner life." Isabel judged best not to show this letter to her uncle, but she acquainted him with its purport, and, as she expected, he begged her instantly to assure Miss Stackpole, in his name, that he should be delighted to receive her at Gardencourt. "Though she's a literary lady," he said, "I suppose that, being an American, she won't show me up, as that other one did. She has seen others like me." "She has seen no other so delightful," Isabel answered; but she was not altogether at ease about Henrietta's reproductive instincts, which belonged to that side of her friend's character which she regarded with the least complacency. She wrote to Miss Stackpole, however, that she would be very welcome under Mr. Tutchett's roof, and this alert young woman lost no time in announcing her prompt approach. She had gone up to London, and it was from that centre that she took the train for the station nearest to Gardencourt, where Isabel and Ralph were in waiting to receive her. "Shall I love her or shall I hate her?" Ralph asked, while they moved along the platform. "Whichever you do will matter very little to her," said Isabel. "She doesn't care a straw what men think of her." "As a man I'm bound to dislike her then. She must be some kind of a monster. Is she very ugly?" "No, she's decidedly pretty." "A female interviewer? A reporter in petticoats? I'm very curious to see her," Ralph conceded. "It's very easy to laugh at her, but it is not easy to be as brave as she." "I should think not. Crimes of violence and attacks on the person require more or less pluck. Do you suppose she'll interview me?" "Never in the world. She'll not think you of enough importance." "You'll see," said Ralph. "She'll send a description of us all, including Bunchy, to her newspaper." "I shall ask her not to," Isabel answered. "You think she's capable of it, then?" "Perfectly." "And yet you've made her your bosom friend?" "I've not made her my bosom friend, but I like her in spite of her faults." "Ah, well," said Ralph, "I'm afraid I shall dislike her in spite of her merits." "You'll probably fall in love with her at the end of 3 days." "And have my love letters published in the Interviewer? Never!" cried the young man. The train presently arrived, and Miss Stackpole, promptly descending, proved, as Isabel had promised, quite delicately, even though rather provincially, fair. She was a neat, plump person, of medium stature, with a round face, a small mouth, a delicate complexion, a bunch of light brown ringlets at the back of her head, and a peculiarly open, surprised looking eye. The most striking point in her appearance was the remarkable fixedness of this organ, which rested without impudence or defiance, but as if in conscientious exercise of a natural right, upon every object it happened to encounter. It rested in this manner upon Ralph himself, a little arrested by Miss Stackpole's gracious and comfortable aspect, which hinted that it wouldn't be so easy as he had assumed to disapprove of her. She rustled, she shimmered, in fresh dove-coloured draperies, and Ralph saw at a glance that she was as crisp and new and comprehensive as a first issue before the folding. From top to toe she had probably no misprint. She spoke in a clear high voice, a voice not rich but loud, yet after she had taken her place with her companions in Mr. Tutchett's carriage she struck him as not at all in the large type, the type of horrid headings that he had expected. She answered the inquiries made of her by Isabel, however, and in which the young man ventured to join with copious lucidity; and later, in the library at Gardencourt, when she had made the acquaintance of Mr. Tutchett, his wife not having thought it necessary to appear, did more to give the measure of her confidence in her powers. "Well, I should like to know whether you consider yourselves American or English," she broke out. "If once I knew, I could talk to you accordingly." "Talk to us anyhow, and we shall be thankful," Ralph liberally answered. She fixed her eyes on him, and there was something in their character that reminded him of large polished buttons, buttons that might have fixed the elastic loops of some tense receptacle. He seemed to see the reflection of surrounding objects on the pupil. The expression of a button is not usually deemed human, but there was something in Miss Stackpole's gaze that made him, as a very modest man, feel vaguely embarrassed, less inviolate, more dishonoured than he liked. This sensation, it must be added, after he had spent a day or two in her company, sensibly diminished, though it never wholly lapsed. "I don't suppose that you're going to undertake to persuade me that you're an American," she said. "To please you, I'll be an Englishman, I'll be a Turk." "Well, if you can change about that way you're very welcome," Miss Stackpole returned. "I'm sure you understand everything and that differences of nationality are no barrier to you," Ralph went on. Miss Stackpole gazed at him still. "Do you mean the foreign languages?" "The languages are nothing. I mean the spirit, the genius." "I'm not sure that I understand you," said the correspondent of the Interviewer, "but I expect I shall before I leave." "He's what's called a cosmopolite," Isabel suggested. "That means he's a little of everything and not much of any. I must say I think patriotism is like charity. It begins at home." "Ah, but where does home begin, Miss Stackpole?" Ralph inquired. "I don't know where it begins, but I know where it ends. It ended a long time before I got here." Don't you like it over here?" asked Mr. Touchett with his aged, innocent voice. "Well, sir, I haven't quite made up my mind what ground I shall take. I feel a good deal cramped. I felt it on the journey from Liverpool to London." "Perhaps you were in a crowded carriage," Ralph suggested. "Yes, but it was crowded with friends. A party of Americans whose acquaintance I had made upon the steamer. A lovely group from Little Rock, Arkansas. In spite of that I felt cramped. I felt something pressing upon me. I couldn't tell what it was. I felt at the very commencement as if I were not going to accord with the atmosphere. But I suppose I shall make my own atmosphere. That's the true way. Then you can breathe." "Your surroundings seem very attractive." "Ah, we too are a lovely group," said Ralph. "Wait a little and you'll see." Miss Stackpole showed every disposition to wait and evidently was prepared to make a considerable stay at Gardencourt. She occupied herself in the mornings with literary labour, but in spite of this Isabel spent many hours with her friend, who, once her daily task performed, deprecated, in fact, defied isolation. Isabel speedily found occasion to desire her to desist from celebrating the charms of their common sojourn in print, having discovered, on the second morning of Miss Stackpole's visit, that she was engaged on a letter to the interviewer, of which the title, in her exquisitely neat and legible hand exactly that of the copy books which our heroine remembered at school, was Americans and Tudors, Glimpses of Gardencourt. Miss Stackpole, with the best conscience in the world, offered to read her letter to Isabel, who immediately put in her protest. "I don't think you ought to do that. I don't think you ought to describe the place." Henrietta gazed at her as usual. "Why, it's just what the people want, and it's a lovely place." "It's too lovely to be put in the newspapers, and it's not what my uncle wants." "Don't you believe that!" cried Henrietta. "They're always delighted afterwards." "My uncle won't be delighted, nor my cousin either. They'll consider it a breach of hospitality." Miss Stackpole showed no sense of confusion. She simply wiped her pen, very neatly, upon an elegant little implement which she kept for the purpose, and put away her manuscript. "Of course, if you don't approve, I won't do it. But I sacrifice a beautiful subject." "There are plenty of other subjects. There are subjects all round you. We'll take some drives. I'll show you some charming scenery." "Scenery's not my department. I always need a human interest. You know, I'm deeply human, Isabel. I always was," Miss Stackpole rejoined. "I was going to bring in your cousin, the alienated American. There's a great demand just now for the alienated American, and your cousin's a beautiful specimen. I should have handled him severely." "He would have died of it," Isabel exclaimed. "Not of the severity, but of the publicity." "Well, I should have liked to kill him a little. And I should have delighted to do your uncle, who seems to me a much nobler type, the American faithful still. He's a grand old man. I don't see how he can object to my paying him honour." Isabel looked at her companion in much wonderment. It struck her as strange that a nature in which she found so much to esteem should break down so in spots. "My poor Henrietta," she said, "you've no sense of privacy." Henrietta coloured deeply, and for a moment her brilliant eyes were suffused, while Isabel found her more than ever inconsequent. "You do me great injustice," said Miss Stackpole with dignity. "I've never written a word about myself." "I'm very sure of that. But it seems to me one should be modest for others also." "Ah, that's very good," cried Henrietta, seizing her pen again. "Just let me make a note of it, and I'll put it in somewhere." She was a thoroughly good-natured woman, and half an hour later she was in as cheerful a mood as should have been looked for in a newspaper lady in want of matter. "I've promised to do the social side," she said to Isabel, "and how can I do it unless I get ideas? If I can't describe this place, don't you know some place I can describe?" Isabel promised she would bethink herself, and the next day, in conversation with her friend, she happened to mention her visit to Lord Warburton's ancient house. "Ah, you must take me there. That's just the place for me," Miss Stackpole cried. "I must get a glimpse of the nobility." "I can't take you," said Isabel, "but Lord Warburton's coming here, and you'll have a chance to see him and observe him. Only, if you intend to repeat his conversation, I shall certainly give him warning." "Don't do that," her companion pleaded. "I want him to be natural." "An Englishman's never so natural as when he's holding his tongue," Isabel declared. It was not apparent at the end of 3 days that her cousin had, according to her prophecy, lost his heart to their visitor, though he had spent a good deal of time in her society. They strolled about the park together, and sat under the trees, and in the afternoon, when it was delightful to float along the Thames, Miss Stackpole occupied a place in the boat, in which hitherto Ralph had had but a single companion. Her presence proved somewhat less irreducible to soft particles than Ralph had expected in the natural perturbation of his sense of the perfect solubility of that of his cousin; for the correspondent of the Interviewer prompted mirth in him, and he had long since decided that the crescendo of mirth should be the flower of his declining days. Henrietta, on her side, failed a little to justify Isabel's declaration with regard to her indifference to masculine opinion, for poor Ralph appeared to have presented himself to her as an irritating problem, which it would be almost immoral not to work out. "What does he do for a living?" she asked of Isabel the evening of her arrival. "Does he go round all day with his hands in his pockets?" "He does nothing," smiled Isabel. "He's a gentleman of large leisure." "Well, I call that a shame, when I have to work like a car conductor," Miss Stackpole replied. "I should like to show him up." "He's in wretched health. He's quite unfit for work," Isabel urged. "Pshaw! Don't you believe it. I work when I'm sick," cried her friend. Later, when she stepped into the boat on joining the water party, she remarked to Ralph that she supposed he hated her and would like to drown her. "Ah, no," said Ralph. "I keep my victims for a slower torture. And you'd be such an interesting one." "Well, you do torture me, I may say that. But I shock all your prejudices. That's one comfort." "My prejudices? I haven't a prejudice to bless myself with. There's intellectual poverty for you." "The more shame to you. I've some delicious ones. Of course I spoil your flirtation, or whatever it is you call it, with your cousin. But I don't care for that, as I render her the service of drawing you out. She'll see how thin you are." "Ah, do draw me out!" Ralph exclaimed. "So few people will take the trouble." Miss Stackpole, in this undertaking, appeared to shrink from no effort, resorting largely, whenever the opportunity offered, to the natural expedient of interrogation. On the following day the weather was bad, and in the afternoon the young man, by way of providing indoor amusement, offered to show her the pictures. Henrietta strolled through the long gallery in his society, while he pointed out its principal ornaments and mentioned the painters and subjects. Miss Stackpole looked at the pictures in perfect silence, committing herself to no opinion, and Ralph was gratified by the fact that she delivered herself of none of the little ready-made ejaculations of delight of which the visitors to Gardencourt were so frequently lavish. This young lady, indeed, to do her justice, was but little addicted to the use of conventional terms. There was something earnest and inventive in her tone, which at times, in its strained deliberation, suggested a person of high culture speaking a foreign language. Ralph Touchett subsequently learned that she had at one time officiated as art critic to a journal of the other world, but she appeared, in spite of this fact, to carry in her pocket none of the small change of admiration. Suddenly, just after he had called her attention to a charming constable, she turned and looked at him as if he himself had been a picture. "Do you always spend your time like this?" she demanded. "I seldom spend it so agreeably." "Well, you know what I mean. Without any regular occupation?" "Ah," said Ralph, "I'm the idlest man living." Miss Stackpole directed her gaze to the constable again, and Ralph bespoke her attention for a small Lancret hanging near it, which represented a gentleman in pink doublet and hose and a ruff, leaning against the pedestal of the statue of a nymph in a garden, and playing the guitar to two ladies seated on the grass. "That's my ideal of a regular occupation," he said. Miss Stackpole turned to him again, and though her eyes had rested upon the picture, he saw that she had missed the subject. She was thinking of something much more serious. "I don't see how you can reconcile it to your conscience." "My dear lady, I have no conscience." "Well, I advise you to cultivate one. You'll need it the next time you go to America." "I shall probably never go again." "Are you ashamed to show yourself?" Ralph meditated with a mild smile. "I suppose that if one has no conscience one has no shame." "Well, you've got plenty of assurance," Henrietta declared. "Do you consider it right to give up your country?" "Ah, one doesn't give up one's country any more than one gives up one's grandmother. They're both antecedent to choice, elements of one's composition that are not to be eliminated." "I suppose that means that you've tried and been worsted. What do they think of you over here?" "They delight in me." "That's because you truckle to them." "Ah, set it down a little to my natural charm," Ralph sighed. "I don't know anything about your natural charm. If you've got any charm it's quite unnatural. It's wholly acquired, or at least you've tried hard to acquire it living over here. I don't say you've succeeded. It's a charm that I don't appreciate anyway. Make yourself useful in some way and then we'll talk about it." "Well now, tell me what I shall do," said Ralph. "Go right home to begin with." "Yes, I see. And then?" "Take right hold of something." "Well now, what sort of thing?" "Anything you please, so long as you take hold. Some new idea, some big work." "Is it very difficult to take hold?" Ralph inquired. "Not if you put your heart into it." "Ah, my heart," said Ralph. "If it depends upon my heart—" "Haven't you got a heart?" "I had one a few days ago, but I've lost it since." "You're not serious," Miss Stackpole remarked. "That's what's the matter with you." But for all this in a day or two she again permitted him to fix her attention, and on the later occasion assigned a different cause to her mysterious perversity. "I know what's the matter with you, Mr. Tutchett," she said. "You think you're too good to get married." "I thought so till I knew you, Miss Stackpole," Ralph answered, "and then I suddenly changed my mind." "Oh, pshaw!" Harriet groaned. "Then it seemed to me," said Ralph, "that I was not good enough." "It would improve you. Besides, it's your duty." "Ah!" cried the young man. "One has so many duties. Is that a duty too?" "Of course it is. Did you never know that before? It's every one's duty to get married." Ralph meditated a moment. He was disappointed. There was something in Miss Stackpole he had begun to like. It seemed to him that if she was not a charming woman she was at least a very good sort. She was wanting in distinction, but as Isabel had said, she was brave, she went into the cages, she flourished lashes like a spangled lion tamer. He had not supposed her to be capable of vulgar arts, but these last words struck him as a false note. When a marriageable young woman urges matrimony on an unencumbered young man, the most obvious explanation of her conduct is not the altruistic impulse. "Ah, well now, there's a good deal to be said about that," Ralph rejoined. "There may be, but that's the principal thing. I must say I think it looks very exclusive going round all alone, as if you thought no woman was good enough for you. Do you think you're better than any one else in the world? In America it's usual for people to marry." "If it's my duty," Ralph asked, "is it not, by analogy, yours as well?" Mrs. Stackpole's ocular surfaces unwinkingly caught the sun. "Have you the fond hope of finding a flaw in my reasoning? Of course I've as good a right to marry as any one else." "Well then," said Ralph, "I won't say it vexes me to see you single. It delights me rather." "You're not serious yet. You never will be." Shall you not believe me to be so on the day I tell you I desire to give up the practice of going around alone?" Miss Stackpole looked at him for a moment in a manner which seemed to announce a reply that might technically be called encouraging. But to his great surprise this expression suddenly resolved itself into an appearance of alarm and even of resentment. "No, not even then," she answered drily. After which she walked away. "I've not conceived a passion for your friend," Ralph said that evening to Isabel, "though we talked some time this morning about it." "And you said something she didn't like?" the girl replied. Ralph stared. "Has she complained of me?" "She told me she thinks there's something very low in the tone of Europeans towards women." "Does she call me a European?" "One of the worst. She told me you had said to her something that an American never would have said, but she didn't repeat it." Ralph treated himself to a luxury of laughter. "She's an extraordinary combination. Did she think I was making love to her?" "No, I believe even Americans do that. But she apparently thought you mistook the intention of something she had said and put an unkind construction on it." "I thought she was proposing marriage to me and I accepted her. Was that unkind?" Isabel smiled. "It was unkind to me. I don't want you to marry." "My dear cousin, what's one to do among you all?" Ralph demanded. "Miss Stackpole tells me it's my bounden duty and that it's hers, in general, to see I do mine." "She has a great sense of duty," said Isabel gravely. "She has indeed, and it's the motive of everything she says. That's what I like her for. She thinks it's unworthy of you to keep so many things to yourself. That's what she wanted to express. If you thought she was trying to attract you, you were very wrong." "It's true it was an odd way, but I did think she was trying to attract me. Forgive my depravity." "You're very conceited. She had no interested views and never supposed you would think she had." "One must be very modest, then, to talk with such women," Ralph said humbly. "But it's a very strange type. She's too personal, considering that she expects other people not to be. She walks in without knocking at the door." "Yes," Isabel admitted. "She doesn't sufficiently recognise the existence of knockers. And indeed I'm not sure that she doesn't think them rather a pretentious ornament. She thinks one's door should stand ajar. But I persist in liking her." "I persist in thinking her too familiar," Ralph rejoined, naturally somewhat uncomfortable under the sense of having been doubly deceived in Miss Stackpole. "Well," said Isabel, smiling, "I'm afraid it's because she's rather vulgar that I like her." "She would be flattered by your reason." "If I should tell her I wouldn't express it in that way. I should say it's because there's something of the people in her." "What do you know about the people, and what does she, for that matter?" "She knows a great deal, and I know enough to feel that she's a kind of emanation of the great democracy of the continent, the country, the nation. I don't say that she sums it all up, that it would be too much to ask of her. But she suggests it, she vividly figures it." "You like her then for patriotic reasons. I'm afraid it's on those very grounds I object to her." "Ah," said Isabel, with a kind of joyous sigh, "I like so many things. If a thing strikes me with a certain intensity, I accept it. I don't want to swagger, but I suppose I'm rather versatile. I like people to be totally different from Henrietta, in the style of Lord Warburton's sisters, for instance. So long as I look at the Misses Molyneux, they seem to me to answer a kind of ideal. Then Henrietta presents herself, and I'm straightway convinced by her, not so much in respect to herself as in respect to what masses behind her." "Ah, you mean the back view of her," Ralph suggested. "What she says is true," his cousin answered. "You'll never be serious. I like the great country stretching away beyond the rivers and across the prairies, blooming and smiling and spreading till it stops at the green Pacific. A strong, sweet, fresh odour seems to rise from it, and Henrietta, pardon my simile, has something of that odour in her garments." Isabel blushed a little as she concluded this speech, and the blush, together with the momentary ardour she had thrown into it, was so becoming to her that Ralph stood smiling at her for a moment after she had ceased speaking. "I'm not sure the Pacific's so green as that," he said, "but you're a young woman of imagination. Henrietta, however, does smell of the future. It almost knocks one down." Chapter 11 and 12 of The Portrait of a Lady by Henry James. Chapter 11. He took a resolve after this not to misinterpret her words, even when Miss Stackpole appeared to strike the personal note most strongly. He bethought himself that persons, in her view, were simple and homogeneous organisms, and that he, for his own part, was too perverted a representative of the nature of man to have a right to deal with her in strict reciprocity. He carried out his resolve with a great deal of tact, and the young lady found in renewed contact with him no obstacle to the exercise of her genius for unshrinking enquiry, the general application of her confidence. Her situation at Gardencourt, therefore, appreciated as we have seen her to be by Isabel, and full of appreciation herself of that free play of intelligence which, to her sense, rendered Isabel's character a sister spirit, and of the easy venerableness of Mr. Touchett, whose noble tone, as she said, met with her full approval. Her situation at Gardencourt would have been perfectly comfortable had she not conceived an irresistible mistrust of the little lady for whom she had at first supposed herself obliged to allow as mistress of the house. She presently discovered, in truth, that this obligation was of the lightest, and that Mrs. Touchett cared very little how Miss Stackpole behaved. Mrs. Touchett had defined her to Isabel as both an adventuress and a bore, adventuresses usually giving one more of a thrill. She had expressed some surprise at her niece's having selected such a friend, yet had immediately added that she knew Isabel's friends were her own affair, and that she had never undertaken to like them all, or to restrict the girl to those she liked. "If you could see none but the people I like, my dear, you'd have a very small society," Mrs. Touchett frankly admitted, "and I don't think I like any man or woman well enough to recommend them to you. When it comes to recommending, it's a serious affair. I don't like Miss Stackpole. Everything about her displeases me. She talks so much too loud, and looks at one as if one wanted to look at her, which one doesn't. I'm sure she has lived all her life in a boarding house, and I detest the manners and the liberties of such places. If you ask me if I prefer my own manners, which you doubtless think very bad, I'll tell you that I prefer them immensely. Miss Stackpole knows I detest boarding house civilization, and she detests me for detesting it, because she thinks it the highest in the world. She'd like Gardencourt a great deal better if it were a boarding house. For me, I find it almost too much of one. We shall never get on together, therefore, and there's no use trying." Mrs. Touchett was right in guessing that Henrietta disapproved of her, but she had not quite put her finger on the reason. A day or two after Miss Stackpole's arrival, she had made some invidious reflections on American hotels, which excited a vein of counter-argument on the part of the correspondent of the Interviewer, who, in the exercise of her profession, had acquainted herself in the Western world with every form of caravansary. Henrietta expressed the opinion that American hotels were the best in the world, and Mrs. Touchett, fresh from a renewed struggle with them, recorded a conviction that they were the worst. Ralph, with his experimental geniality, suggested, by way of healing the breach, that the truth lay between the two extremes, and that the establishments in question ought to be described as fair middling. This contribution to the discussion, however, Miss Stackpole rejected with scorn. Middling, indeed! If they were not the best in the world, they were the worst, but there was nothing middling about an American hotel. "We judge from different points of view, evidently," said Mrs. Touchett. "I like to be treated as an individual. You like to be treated as a party." "I don't know what you mean," Henrietta replied. "I like to be treated as an American lady." "Poor American ladies!" cried Mrs. Touchett with a laugh. "They're the slaves of slaves." "They're the companions of freemen," Henrietta retorted. "They're the companions of their servants, the Irish chambermaid and the negro waiter. They share their work." "Do you call the domestics in an American household slaves?" Miss Stackpole inquired. "If that's the way you desire to treat them, no wonder you don't like America." "If you've not got good servants, you're miserable," Mrs. Touchett serenely said. "They're very bad in America, but I have 5 perfect ones in Florence." "I don't see what you want with 5," Henrietta couldn't help observing. "I don't think I should like to see 5 persons surrounding me in that menial position." "I like them in that position better than in some others," proclaimed Mrs. Touchett with much meaning. "Should you like me better if I were your butler, dear?" her husband asked. "I don't think I should. You wouldn't at all have the tenue." "The companions of freemen. I like that, Miss Stackpole," said Ralph. "It's a beautiful description." "When I said freemen, I didn't mean you, sir." And this was the only reward that Ralph got for his compliment. Miss Stackpole was baffled. She evidently thought there was something treasonable in Mrs. Touchett's appreciation of a class which she privately judged to be a mysterious survival of feudalism. It was perhaps because her mind was oppressed with this image that she suffered some days to elapse before she took occasion to say to Isabel, "My dear friend, I wonder if you're growing faithless." "Faithless? Faithless to you, Henrietta?" "No, that would be a great pain, but it's not that." "Faithless to my country, then?" "Ah, that I hope will never be. When I wrote to you from Liverpool, I said I had something particular to tell you. You never asked me what it is. Is it because you've suspected?" "Suspected what? As a rule, I don't think I suspect," said Isabel. "I remember now that phrase in your letter, but I confess I had forgotten it. What have you to tell me?" Henrietta looked disappointed, and her steady gaze betrayed it. "You don't ask that right, as if you thought it important. You're changed. You're thinking of other things." "Tell me what you mean, and I'll think of that." "Will you really think of it? That's what I wish to be sure of." "I've not much control of my thoughts, but I'll do my best," said Isabel. Henrietta gazed at her in silence for a period which tried Isabel's patience, so that our heroine added at last, "Do you mean that you're going to be married?" "Not till I've seen Europe," said Miss Stackpole. "What are you laughing at?" she went on. "What I mean is that Mr. Goodwood came out in the steamer with me." "Ah!" Isabel responded. "You say that right. I had a good deal of talk with him. He has come after you." "Did he tell you so?" "No, he told me nothing. That's how I knew it," said Henrietta cleverly. "He said very little about you, but I spoke of you a good deal." Isabel waited. At the mention of Mr. Goodwood's name she had turned a little pale. "I'm very sorry you did that," she observed at last. "It was a pleasure to me, and I liked the way he listened. I could have talked a long time to such a listener. He was so quiet, so intense. He drank it all in." "What did you say about me?" Isabel asked. "I said you were, on the whole, the finest creature I knew." "I'm very sorry for that. He thinks too well of me already. He oughtn't to be encouraged." "He's dying for a little encouragement. I see his face now, and his earnest, absorbed look, while I talked. I never saw an ugly man look so handsome." "He's very simple-minded," said Isabel, "and he's not so ugly." "There's nothing so simplifying as a grand passion." "It's not a grand passion. I'm very sure it's not that." "You don't say that as if you were sure." Isabel gave a rather cold smile. "I shall say it better to Mr. Goodwood himself." "He'll soon give you a chance," said Henrietta. Isabel offered no answer to this assertion, which her companion made with an air of great confidence. "He'll find you changed," the latter pursued. You've been affected by your new surroundings." "Very likely. I'm affected by everything." "By everything but Mr. Goodwood," Miss Stackpole exclaimed, with a slightly harsh hilarity. Isabel failed even to smile back, and in a moment she said: "Did he ask you to speak to me?" "Not in so many words, but his eyes asked it, and his handshake when he bade me good bye." "Thank you for doing so." And Isabel turned away. "Yes, you're changed. You've got new ideas over here," her friend continued. "I hope so," said Isabel. "One should get as many new ideas as possible." "Yes, but they shouldn't interfere with the old ones when the old ones have been the right ones." Isabel turned about again. "If you mean that I had any idea with Mr. Goodwood—" But she faltered before her friend's implacable glitter. "My dear child, you certainly encouraged him." Isabel made for the moment as if to deny this charge, instead of which, however, she presently answered: "It's very true. I did encourage him." And then she asked if her companion had learned from Mr. Goodwood what he intended to do. It was a concession to her curiosity, for she disliked discussing the subject and found Henrietta wanting in delicacy. "I asked him, and he said he meant to do nothing," Miss Stackpole answered. "But I don't believe that. He's not a man to do nothing. He is a man of high, bold action. Whatever happens to him, he'll always do something, and whatever he does will always be right." "I quite believe that." Henrietta might be wanting in delicacy, but it touched the girl, all the same, to hear this declaration. "Ah, you do care for him!" her visitor rang out. "Whatever he does will always be right," Isabel repeated. "When a man's of that infallible mould, what does it matter to him what one feels?" "It may not matter to him, but it matters to oneself." "Ah, what it matters to me, that's not what we're discussing," said Isabel with a cold smile. This time her companion was grave. "Well, I don't care. You have changed. You're not the girl you were a few short weeks ago, and Mr. Goodwood will see it. I expect him here any day." "I hope he'll hate me then," said Isabel. "I believe you hope it about as much as I believe him capable of it." To this observation our heroine made no return. She was absorbed in the alarm given her by Henrietta's intimation that Caspar Goodwood would present himself at Gardencourt. She pretended to herself, however, that she thought the event impossible, and later she communicated her disbelief to her friend. For the next 48 hours, nevertheless, she stood prepared to hear the young man's name announced. The feeling pressed upon her; it made the air sultry, as if there were to be a change of weather; and the weather, socially speaking, had been so agreeable during Isabel's stay at Gardencourt that any change would be for the worse. Her suspense indeed was dissipated the second day. She had walked into the park in company with the sociable Bunchy, and after strolling about for some time, in a manner at once listless and restless, had seated herself on a garden bench, within sight of the house, beneath a spreading beech, where, in a white dress ornamented with black ribbons, she formed among the flickering shadows a graceful and harmonious image. She entertained herself for some moments with talking to the little terrier, as to whom the proposal of an ownership divided with her cousin had been applied as impartially as possible, as impartially as Bunchy's own somewhat fickle and inconstant sympathies would allow. But she was notified for the first time on this occasion of the finite character of Bunchy's intellect. Hitherto she had been mainly struck with its extent. It seemed to her at last that she would do well to take a book. Formerly, when heavy-hearted, she had been able, with the help of some well-chosen volume, to transfer the seat of consciousness to the organ of pure reason. Of late, it was not to be denied, literature had seemed a fading light, and even after she had reminded herself that her uncle's library was provided with a complete set of those authors which no gentleman's collection should be without, she sat motionless and empty-handed, her eyes bent on the cool green turf of the lawn. Her meditations were presently interrupted by the arrival of a servant who handed her a letter. The letter bore the London postmark and was addressed in a hand she knew. That came into her vision, already so held by him, with the vividness of the writer's voice or his face. The document proved short and may be given entire. My dear Miss Archer, I don't know whether you will have heard of my coming to England, but even if you have not, it will scarcely be a surprise to you. You will remember that when you gave me my dismissal at Albany 3 months ago, I did not accept it. I protested against it. You, in fact, appeared to accept my protest, and to admit that I had the right on my side. I had come to see you with the hope that you would let me bring you over to my conviction. My reasons for entertaining this hope had been of the best. But you disappointed it. I found you changed, and you were able to give me no reason for the change. You admitted that you were unreasonable, and it was the only concession you would make, but it was a very cheap one, because that's not your character. No, you are not, and you never will be, arbitrary or capricious. Therefore it is that I believe you will let me see you again. You told me that I'm not disagreeable to you, and I believe it, for I don't see why that should be. I shall always think of you. I shall never think of any one else. I came to England simply because you are here. I couldn't stay at home after you had gone. I hated the country because you were not in it. If I like this country at present, it is only because it holds you. I have been to England before, but have never enjoyed it much. May I not come and see you for half an hour? This at present is the dearest wish of yours faithfully, Caspar Goodwood. Isabel read this missive with such deep attention that she had not perceived an approaching tread on the soft grass. Looking up, however, as she mechanically folded it, she saw Lord Warburton standing before her. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. She put the letter into her pocket and offered her visitor a smile of welcome, exhibiting no trace of discomposure, and half surprised at her coolness. "They told me you were out here," said Lord Warburton, "and as there was no one in the drawing room and it's really you that I wished to see, I came out with no more ado." Isabel had got up. She felt a wish for the moment that he should not sit down beside her. "I was just going indoors." "Please don't do that. It's much jollier here. I've ridden over from Lochley. It's a lovely day." His smile was peculiarly friendly and pleasing, and his whole person seemed to emit that radiance of good feeling and good fare which had formed the charm of the girl's first impression of him. It surrounded him like a zone of fine June weather. "We'll walk about a little then," said Isabel, who could not divest herself of the sense of an intention on the part of her visitor, and who wished both to elude the intention and to satisfy her curiosity about it. It had flashed upon her vision once before, and it had given her on that occasion, as we know, a certain alarm. The alarm was composed of several elements, not all of which were disagreeable. She had indeed spent some days in analysing them, and had succeeded in separating the pleasant part of the idea of Lord Warburton's making up to her from the painful. It may appear to some readers that the young lady was both precipitate and unduly fastidious, but the latter of these facts, if the charge be true, may serve to exonerate her from the discredit of the former. She was not eager to convince herself that a territorial magnate, as she had heard Lord Warburton called, was smitten with her charms. The fact of a declaration from such a source carrying with it really more questions than it would answer. She had received a strong impression of his being a personage, and she had occupied herself in examining the image so conveyed. At the risk of adding to the evidence of her self-sufficiency, it must be said that there had been moments when this possibility of admiration by a personage represented to her an aggression almost to the degree of an affront, quite to the degree of an inconvenience. She had never yet known a personage. There had been no personages in this sense in her life. There were probably none such at all in her native land. When she had thought of individual eminence she had thought of it on the basis of character and wit, of what one might like in a gentleman's mind and in his talk. She herself was a character; she couldn't help being aware of that, and hitherto her visions of a completed consciousness had connected themselves largely with moral images, things as to which the question would be whether they pleased her sublime soul. Lord Warburton loomed up before her, largely and brightly, as a collection of attributes and powers which were not to be measured by this simple rule, but which demanded a different sort of appreciation, an appreciation that the girl, with her habit of judging quickly and freely, felt she lacked patience to bestow. He appeared to demand of her something that no one else, as it were, had presumed to do. What she felt was that a territorial, a political, a social magnate had conceived the design of drawing her into the system in which he rather invidiously lived and moved. A certain instinct, not imperious but persuasive, told her to resist, murmured to her that virtually she had a system and an orbit of her own. It told her other things besides, things which both contradicted and confirmed each other, that a girl might do much worse than trust herself to such a man, and that it would be very interesting to see something of his system from his own point of view; that on the other hand, however, there was evidently a great deal of it which she should regard only as a complication of every hour, and that even in the whole there was something stiff and stupid which would make it a burden. Furthermore, there was a young man lately come from America who had no system at all, but who had a character of which it was useless for her to try to persuade herself that the impression on her mind had been light. The letter she carried in her pocket all sufficiently reminded her of the contrary. Smile not, however, I venture to repeat, at this simple young woman from Albany, who debated whether she should accept an English peer before he had offered himself, and who was disposed to believe that on the whole she could do better. She was a person of great good faith, and if there was a great deal of folly in her wisdom, those who judge her severely may have the satisfaction of finding that, later, she became consistently wise only at the cost of an amount of folly which will constitute almost a direct appeal to charity. Lord Warburton seemed quite ready to walk, to sit, or to do anything that Isabel should propose, and he gave her this assurance with his usual air of being particularly pleased to exercise a social virtue. But he was, nevertheless, not in command of his emotions, and as he strolled beside her for a moment, in silence, looking at her without letting her know it, there was something embarrassed in his glance and his misdirected laughter. Yes, assuredly, as we have touched on the point, we may return to it for a moment again. The English are the most romantic people in the world, and Lord Warburton was about to give an example of it. He was about to take a step which would astonish all his friends and displease a great many of them, and which had superficially nothing to recommend it. The young lady who trod the turf beside him had come from a queer country across the sea, which he knew a good deal about. Her antecedents, her associations were very vague to his mind, except in so far as they were generic, and in this sense they showed as distinct and unimportant. Miss Archer had neither a fortune nor the sort of beauty that justifies a man to the multitude, and he calculated that he had spent about 26 hours in her company. He had summed up all this, the perversity of the impulse, which had declined to avail itself of the most liberal opportunities to subside, and the judgment of mankind as exemplified particularly in the more quickly judging half of it. He had looked these things well in the face, and then had dismissed them from his thoughts. He cared no more for them than for the rosebud in his buttonhole. It is the good fortune of a man who for the greater part of a lifetime has abstained without effort from making himself disagreeable to his friends, that when the need comes for such a course it is not discredited by irritating associations. "I hope you had a pleasant ride," said Isabel, who observed her companion's hesitancy. "It would have been pleasant if for nothing else than that it brought me here." "Are you so fond of Gardencourt?" the girl asked, more and more sure that he meant to make some appeal to her, wishing not to challenge him if he hesitated, and yet to keep all the quietness of her reason if he proceeded. It suddenly came upon her that her situation was one which a few weeks ago she would have deemed deeply romantic: the park of an old English country house, with the foreground embellished by a great, as she supposed, nobleman in the act of making love to a young lady, who, on careful inspection, should be found to present remarkable analogies with herself. But if she was now the heroine of the situation, she succeeded scarcely the less in looking at it from the outside. "I care nothing for Gardencourt," said her companion. "I care only for you." "You've known me too short a time to have a right to say that, and I can't believe you're serious." These words of Isabel's were not perfectly sincere, for she had no doubt whatever that he himself was. They were simply a tribute to the fact, of which he was perfectly aware, that those he had just uttered would have excited surprise on the part of a vulgar world. And moreover, if anything beside the sense she had already acquired that Lord Warburton was not a loose thinker had been needed to convince her, the tone in which he replied would quite have served the purpose. "One's right in such a matter is not measured by the time, Miss Archer. It's measured by the feeling itself. If I were to wait 3 months it would make no difference. I shall not be more sure of what I mean than I am to day. Of course I've seen you very little, but my impression dates from the very first hour we met. I lost no time. I fell in love with you then. It was at first sight, as the novels say. I know now that's not a fancy phrase, and I shall think better of novels for evermore. Those 2 days I spent here settled it. I don't know whether you suspected I was doing so, but I paid, mentally speaking, I mean, the greatest possible attention to you. Nothing you said, nothing you did was lost upon me. When you came to Lockley the other day, or rather when you went away, I was perfectly sure. Nevertheless, I made up my mind to think it over and to question myself narrowly. I've done so. All these days I've done nothing else. I don't make mistakes about such things. I'm a very judicious animal. I don't go off easily, but when I'm touched, it's for life. It's for life, Miss Archer, it's for life," Lord Warburton repeated in the kindest, tenderest, pleasantest voice Isabel had ever heard, and looking at her with eyes charged with the light of a passion that had sifted itself clear of the baser parts of emotion, the heat, the violence, the unreason, and that burned as steadily as a lamp in a windless place. By tacit consent as he talked, they had walked more and more slowly, and at last they stopped and he took her hand. "Ah, Lord Warburton, how little you know me," Isabel said very gently. Gently, too, she drew her hand away. "Don't taunt me with that. That I don't know you better makes me unhappy already. It's all my loss. But that's what I want, and it seems to me I'm taking the best way. If you'll be my wife, then I shall know you, and when I tell you all the good I think of you, you'll not be able to say it's from ignorance." "If you know me little, I know you even less," said Isabel. "You mean that, unlike yourself, I may not approve on acquaintance? Ah, of course that's very possible. But think, to speak to you as I do, how determined I must be to try and give satisfaction. You do like me rather, don't you?" "I like you very much, Lord Warburton," she answered, and at this moment she liked him immensely. "I thank you for saying that. It shows you don't regard me as a stranger. I really believe I've filled all the other relations of life very creditably, and I don't see why I shouldn't fill this one, in which I offer myself to you, seeing that I care so much more about it. Ask the people who know me well. I've friends who'll speak for me." "I don't need the recommendation of your friends," said Isabel. "Ah, now that's delightful of you. You believe in me yourself." "Completely," Isabel declared. She quite glowed there, inwardly, with the pleasure of feeling she did. The light in her companion's eyes turned into a smile, and he gave a long exhalation of joy. "If you're mistaken, Miss Archer, Let me lose all I possess." She wondered whether he meant this for a reminder that he was rich, and on the instant felt sure that he didn't. He was thinking that, as he would have said himself, and indeed he might safely leave it to the memory of any interlocutor, especially of one to whom he was offering his hand. Isabel had prayed that she might not be agitated, and her mind was tranquil enough, even while she listened and asked herself what it was best she should say, to indulge in this incidental criticism. What she should say had she asked herself? Her foremost wish was to say something, if possible, not less kind than what he had said to her. His words had carried perfect conviction with them. She felt she did, also mysteriously, matter to him. "I thank you more than I can say for your offer," she returned at last. "It does me great honour." "Ah, don't say that!" he broke out. "I was afraid you'd say something like that. I don't see what you've to do with that sort of thing. I don't see why you should thank me. It's I who ought to thank you for listening to me. A man you know so little coming down to you with such a thumper. Of course it's a great question. I must tell you that I'd rather ask it than have to answer myself. But the way you've listened, or at least your having listened at all, gives me some hope." "Don't hope too much," Isabel said. "Oh, Miss Archer," her companion murmured, smiling again in his seriousness, as if such a warning might perhaps be taken but as the play of high spirits, the exuberance of elation. "Should you be greatly surprised if I were to beg you not to hope at all?" Isabel asked. "Surprised? I don't know what you mean by surprise. It wouldn't be that. It would be a feeling very much worse." Isabel walked on again. She was silent for some minutes. "I'm very sure that, highly as I already think of you, my opinion of you, if I should know you well, would only rise. But I'm by no means sure that you wouldn't be disappointed. And I say that not in the least out of conventional modesty. It's perfectly sincere." "I'm willing to risk it, Miss Archer," her companion replied. "It's a great question, as you say. It's a very difficult question." "I don't expect you, of course, to answer it outright. Think it over as long as it may be necessary. If I can gain by waiting, I'll gladly wait a long time. Only remember that in the end my dearest happiness depends on your answer." "I should be very sorry to keep you in suspense," said Isabel. "Oh, don't mind. I'd much rather have got a good answer 6 months hence than a bad one to day." "But it's very probable that even 6 months hence I shouldn't be able to give you one that you'd think good." "Why not, since you really like me?" "Ah, you must never doubt that," said Isabel. "Well, then, I don't see what more you ask." "It's not what I ask. It's what I can give. I don't think I should suit you. I really don't think I should." "You needn't worry about that. That's my affair. You needn't be a better royalist than the King." "It's not only that," said Isabel, "but I'm not sure I wish to marry any one." "Very likely you don't. I've no doubt a great many women begin that way," said his lordship, who, be it averred, did not in the least believe in the axiom he thus beguiled his anxiety by uttering. "But they're frequently persuaded." "Ah, that's because they want to be," and Isabel lightly laughed. Her suitor's countenance fell, and he looked at her for a while in silence. "I'm afraid it's my being an Englishman that makes you hesitate," he said presently. "I know your uncle thinks you ought to marry in your own country." Isabel listened to this assertion with some interest. It had never occurred to her that Mr. Touchett was likely to discuss her matrimonial prospects with Lord Warburton. "Has he told you that?" "I remember his making the remark. He spoke perhaps of Americans generally." "He appears himself to have found it very pleasant to live in England." Isabel spoke in a manner that might have seemed a little perverse, but which expressed both her constant perception of her uncle's outward felicity and her general disposition to elude any obligation to take a restricted view. It gave her companion hope, and he immediately cried with warmth, "Ah, my dear Miss Archer, old England's a very good sort of country, you know. And it will be still better when we've furbished it up a little." "Oh, don't furbish it, Lord Warburton. Leave it alone. I like it this way." "Well, then, if you like it, I'm more and more unable to see your objection to what I propose." "I'm afraid I can't make you understand." "You ought at least to try. I've a fair intelligence. Are you afraid of the climate? We can easily live elsewhere, you know. You can pick out your climate the whole world over." These words were uttered with a breadth of candour that was like the embrace of strong arms, that was like the fragrance straight in her face, and by his clean breathing lips, of she knew not what strange gardens, what charged airs. She would have given her little finger at that moment to feel strongly and simply the impulse to answer: "Lord Warburton, it's impossible for me to do better in this wonderful world, I think, than commit myself very gratefully to your loyalty." But though she was lost in admiration of her opportunity, she managed to move back into the deepest shade of it, even as some wild caught creature in a vast cage. The splendid security so offered her was not the greatest she could conceive. What she finally bethought herself of saying was something very different, something that deferred the need of really facing her crisis. "Don't think me unkind if I ask you to say no more about this to day." "Certainly, certainly," her companion cried. "I wouldn't bore you for the world." "You've given me a great deal to think about, and I promise you to do it justice." "That's all I ask of you, of course, and that you'll remember how absolutely my happiness is in your hands." Isabel listened with extreme respect to this admonition, but she said after a minute: "I must tell you that what I shall think about is some way of letting you know that what you ask is impossible, letting you know it without making you miserable." "There's no way to do that, Miss Archer. I won't say that if you refuse me you'll kill me. I shall not die of it. But I shall do worse. I shall live to no purpose." "You'll live to marry a better woman than I." "Don't say that, please," said Lord Warburton very gravely. "That's fair to neither of us." "To marry a worse one, then." "If there are better women than you, I prefer the bad ones. That's all I can say," he went on with the same earnestness. "There's no accounting for tastes." His gravity made her feel equally grave, and she showed it by again requesting him to drop the subject for the present. "I'll speak to you myself very soon. Perhaps I shall write to you." "At your convenience, yes," he replied. "Whatever time you take, it must seem to me long, and I suppose I must make the best of that." "I shall not keep you in suspense. I only want to collect my mind a little." He gave a melancholy sigh and stood looking at her a moment with his hands behind him, giving short nervous shakes to his hunting crop. "Do you know I'm very much afraid of it, of that remarkable mind of yours?" Our heroine's biographer can scarcely tell why, but the question made her start and brought a conscious blush to her cheek. She returned his look a moment, and then with a note in her voice that might almost have appealed to his compassion: "So am I, my lord," she oddly exclaimed. His compassion was not stirred, however. All he possessed of the faculty of pity was needed at home. "Ah, be merciful, he murmured. "I think you had better go," said Isabel. "I'll write to you." "Very good, but whatever you write I'll come and see you, you know." And then he stood reflecting, his eyes fixed on the observant countenance of Bunchy, who had the air of having understood all that had been said and of pretending to carry off the indiscretion by a simulated fit of curiosity as to the roots of an ancient oak. "There's one thing more," he went on. "You know, if you don't like Lochley, if you think it's damp or anything of that sort, you need never go within 50 miles of it. It's not damp, by the way. I've had the house thoroughly examined. It's perfectly safe and right. But if you shouldn't fancy it you needn't dream of living in it. There's no difficulty whatever about that. There are plenty of houses. I thought I'd just mention it. Some people don't like a moat, you know. Good-bye." "I adore a moat," said Isabel. "Good-bye." He held out his hand, and she gave him hers a moment long enough for him to bend his handsome bared head and kiss it. Then, still agitating, in his mastered emotion, his implement of the chase, he walked rapidly away. He was evidently much upset. Isabel herself was upset, but she had not been affected as she would have imagined. What she felt was not a great responsibility, a great difficulty of choice. It appeared to her that there had been no choice in the question. She couldn't marry Lord Warburton. The idea failed to support any enlightened prejudice in favour of the free exploration of life that she had hitherto entertained or was now capable of entertaining. She must write this to him, she must convince him, and that duty was comparatively simple. But what disturbed her, in the sense that it struck her with wonderment, was this very fact that it cost her so little to refuse a magnificent chance. With whatever qualifications one would, Lord Warburton had offered her a great opportunity. The situation might have discomforts, might contain oppressive, might contain narrowing elements, might prove really but a stupefying anodyne, but she did her sex no injustice in believing that 19 women out of 20 would have accommodated themselves to it without a pang. Why then upon her also should it not irresistibly impose itself? Who was she, what was she, that she should hold herself superior? What view of life, what design upon fate, what conception of happiness had she that pretended to be larger than these fabulous occasions? If she wouldn't do such a thing as that, then she must do great things. She must do something greater. Poor Isabel found ground to remind herself from time to time that she must not be too proud, and nothing could be more sincere than her prayer to be delivered from such a danger. The isolation and loneliness of pride had for her mind the horror of a desert place. If it had been pride that interfered with her accepting Lord Warburton, such a bêtise was singularly misplaced, and she was so conscious of liking him that she ventured to assure herself it was the very softness and the fine intelligence of sympathy. She liked him too much to marry him, that was the truth. Something assured her there was a fallacy somewhere in the glowing logic of the proposition as he saw it, even though she mightn't put her very finest finger point on it. And to inflict upon a man who offered so much a wife with a tendency to criticise would be a peculiarly discreditable act. She had promised him she would consider his question, and when, after he had left her, she wandered back to the bench where he had found her and lost herself in meditation, it might have seemed that she was keeping her vow. But this was not the case. She was wondering if she were not a cold, hard, priggish person, and on her at last getting up and going rather quickly back to the house, felt, as she had said to a friend, really frightened at herself. Chapter 13